This is the 18th Airborne Corps podcast, the official podcast of America's Contingency Corps. Recorded every week right here at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the center of the military universe.
There's no single truth in war. That's a central theme in the Ken Burns series, The Vietnam War. It's dangerous to try to make the Vietnam War, or really any complicated historical event, a binary lesson, a notion of right versus wrong, good versus evil. It's dangerous to make any complicated event a simplified cautionary tale. The Vietnam War is too big. It has too many players. It has too many underlying philosophies. In Ken Burns' hands, all of the ideas underpinning that war come to life on the screen. My name is Joe Buccino, and I host this show. This is the 18th Airborne Corps podcast. As the title makes clear, this is the official podcast of the 18th Airborne Corps, an Army organization headquartered on Fort Bragg, North Carolina. This show used to be called The Doomsday Clock. We've changed the title, but it's really the same show. Every Tuesday, we release a new episode about some aspect of life in the 18th Airborne Corps. Some weeks, the show is about history, and that's where we are today. Some weeks it's about current events, like it was last week with the COVID vaccine discussion. This is episode 14 of the show. This episode features Ken Burns. It's a great, fascinating discussion. Ken Burns, of course, is a national treasure. He is an icon. He is a legendary documentary filmmaker. He's also critical to our American understanding of our own history. He has produced and directed some of the most acclaimed historical documentaries ever made. There is a production technique named after him, the Ken Burns effect. This is the panning and zooming of a still photograph. The process makes an image come alive. It almost brings the viewer into the photograph, into the subject at the root of history. The Civil War series, launched in 1990, has been watched by hundreds of millions of Americans. It certainly brought me a new understanding of the perspective of the soldier on both sides. The War, which was released in 2007 and covers really every single aspect of World War II, captured how that war shaped life in small-town America. It's a bottom-up view of the American entry in that war, and it presented the American experience of that war in a way I'd never considered. The Roosevelts, it was one of the most engrossing series I've ever seen. It made me rethink how I view Teddy Roosevelt, the way I think about American politics. Like a lot of people my age, I remember the Central Park jogger case. It turns out I didn't really understand it, as I found out watching the Central Park 5, a film which helped force New York City to settle the case against the men wrongly accused and wrongly jailed for that crime. But even larger than that, it made me rethink how I understand reporting around sensational violent crimes. For me, these films broaden my understanding of what it means to be an American, and what it means to feel and understand American history. For me, none of them had the impact of the Vietnam War, a sweeping series that covers every aspect of that war. It's exhausting. It's emotionally draining. It's 10 episodes. It's 18 hours. It is a commitment. I imagine that if you're listening to this right now, you've already made that commitment. You've already watched the entire series. I've watched it in its entirety 3 times since it was released in October 2017. It's devastating while it's optimistic. It's the story of war itself. It is the story of humanity itself. It is the story of history itself. History, the thing itself, has come for us at long last in this film. And it really is a great shame if you don't see it. So, this discussion is about that series. This discussion is about the big stuff. This is larger than any battle. It's larger than the politics of the war. It's larger than Nixon or LBJ or Kennedy. It's larger than Tet. It's larger than the 101st or the 82nd, our units that fought in Vietnam. Now, all of these things, all these people are characters in this series. They're characters in a tragedy. The opening sequence, if you haven't seen it, is devastating. I won't describe it, but it left me with the feeling that all of this could have been avoided. None of this suffering was fated. We're honored that Ken Burns agreed to be on the show. It was great to have him. This was a fascinating discussion. Thanks for listening to the show, and here is my interview with a legend.
What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Joe Buccino here. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thank you so much. I know you're on a timeline, but thank you so much for joining us. We're talking about the Vietnam War series. Probably just get right into it, sir.
Yeah, please. I know we only have 20 minutes or so I'm happy to just jump in as you're ready.
You know, what's interesting is there's kind of a stripping away of certainty as you watch this. And, you know, I came into the Army in large part following the Vietnam War, and my understanding of the Vietnam War pushed me into the Army. But, you know, the kind of broad perspective you give, you know, soldiers, protestors, draft dodgers on the American side, you know, the peasants in the Vietnamese side, the North Vietnamese, South, there's a real, I think, stripping away of what you thought you understood and what you thought you knew, at least for me. Was that the case for you in putting this together over such a long time?
You know, it was, sir. I grew up 10 to 18 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which was a hotbed of anti-war activity. The first teach-in was held at the University of Michigan. My father's department was one of the sponsors of that, the anthropology department. I went into this project thinking I knew something about it. Normally, I pick my topics sort of wanting to do something that I don't know. I probably knew less really what happened in the Vietnam War than anything. So the 10 and a half years it took us to make it was a daily humiliation. And I mean that in a good way. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You think you're well-toned, and then you go to boot camp, right? And you find out you're not as well-toned as you thought you were. And that's, in a way, what it was for us. And to your earlier point, I think it was really important for us to tell a really complete story. And everything in our culture is so binary, right? You either have the war from the point of view of the anti-war protesters that it was bad, or you have it from the heroic point of view of just these brave men, all true, charging hills and doing this and being betrayed perhaps by this thing or that thing. And what we wanted to do was to get as many different perspectives as possible. You know that in order to fix a target in battle, it really is helpful if you can triangulate. That is to say, if you know a few different reference points. And so for us, it was important to tell as many different stories as possible. It was not like the Japanese classic Rashomon, in which each person had a different point of view. They certainly did. But it didn't contribute to the fact that everything is subjective, which of course it is, but it permitted us to aggregate all these stories. The recent scholarship that has opened up in Vietnam that's permitted us to understand, you know, military strategy, what their point of view was at the time of the Tonkin Gulf incident. You know, the presidential tapes are being gone through by scholars, and we can begin to understand that if a president, Johnson or Nixon, says this to the public, but that morning or that evening he said the exact opposite to somebody, that's a pretty telling thing. So we were interested in that. And as you pointed out, what happens inevitably in the story of Vietnam is that we leave out the people for whom we were supposedly fighting, and we leave out the people who were our enemies. And so for us to interview Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers and North Vietnamese civilians was important, but it was perhaps even more important to interview South Vietnamese soldiers and South Vietnamese civilians, and, you know, that to get that point of view, in addition to the whole kaleidoscope, the whole prism of American things, from Gold Star mothers and highly decorated soldiers to draft protesters, draft resistors, even a deserter, you know, so that you have this triangulation that I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I read so much about Vietnam really starting as a teenager and never really stopped. And so often the American history of Vietnam is, you know, it's JFK, you know, build up, LBJ, Marine commitment, Tet, and the Vietnamese are kind of part of the scenery. And
That's right.
that's why, there's a book, The Sympathizer. It's a wonderful novel.
It is a wonderful, wonderful book. We love it.
Yeah, and so that really was so, I think, inspirational. And so was this show, your series. What's interesting is, like, for everybody, there's a heart in there. There's a heart in the protester. There's the heart in the guy, I don't remember his name, who went to Canada and regretted giving up his American citizenship. There's a heart in Tim O'Brien, who didn't go to Canada and regrets not doing that. There's a heart in the North Vietnamese fighters. So I think there's a lot of suffering and there's a lot of sorrow, but there's, for me, a sense of optimism about humanity.
Yes, I agree. I'm so glad you put it exactly that way, and I don't think anyone's ever summed it up. We tried to do it at the very end of the last episode, where we said that essentially there's nothing about the war that's redeemable. Mm-hmm. But what is redeemable are the individual stories. And your word, heart, I would also say courage. It takes courage to say no. As Tim O'Brien, who I've continued to maintain a friendship with, he actually felt he was a coward by going, right? Mm-hmm. Some people, it was courage to go. I think all of that is important. And let's not forget our Gold Star mother, who just passed away. She had to get the worst news that any mother ever gets, right? And then she didn't need to tell us this. She didn't need to tell the world this. She knew that by telling us, everyone would know. But she also knew and found a reservoir of courage to relive those days, including the worst day of her life, because she thought it might help other people. Same with John Musgrave, who is severely wounded up in I Corps and is, comes back and spends, months and months in a Navy hospital and then still is dealing with his war wound, still to this day. And of course had a hard time on college campus, justifying it. And as he said, dating my 45 as he puts an imaginary forefinger and thumb, barrel and trigger under his chin or up against his head, and didn't one day when he was absolutely certain he was going to, and how many lives that may have saved. I just think there's acts of courage. The young woman who takes a volume of Ernest Hemingway, the subject of our most recent film that's coming out next month, down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where she's doing the arduous work as a teenager of repairing the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the damage done by our plane. And it's not one road, of course. It's a braided river of many jungle paths. And it's incredibly dangerous work. And she thinks that she was able to survive reading Hemingway's story of the Spanish Civil War. I mean, it's just, you can't make this stuff up, which is why people say, well, why don't you just go into Hollywood? I said, this is as dramatic as anything I know. The real stuff is dramatic. Carl Marlantes kind of running up a hill. What those Marines face up in I Corps there in the fall of '67. I mean, it's just, not just John Musgrave, but Roger Harris and the others that we talked to. It's just incredible. Or the brave South Vietnamese soldier who's now living in Houston, who's one of the bravest men I've ever met in my life, who, got shot twice by VC and played dead for 3 days and crawled his way out of Binh Ja, I think the battle was.
Yeah, one of the characters to me that's fascinating, always been fascinating, is Lyndon Johnson. And, he has so much percolating beneath the surface. He's incredibly insecure. Yeah. He also really wants to focus on his, domestic agenda and wants nothing to do with this. And, what I'm about to say is to some people, a terrible comparison. But, you mentioned John Musgrave, Carl Marlantes. There's a connection between John Musgrave and Lyndon Johnson. In some sense, they're both trapped by Vietnam. Not in the same way, obviously. Not physically, obviously. John Musgrave is a victim of all this, of Lyndon Johnson's policies in some ways. But there is some sort of tenuous connection there, isn't there?
I think so. And I think the important thing, you hit it right, is how we can begin to dissolve the conventional wisdom. If Kennedy had lived, he wouldn't have gotten us into Vietnam. Well, he inherited 700 advisors from Dwight Eisenhower. And 1,000 days later, there were 17,000. And as you quite correctly said, Lyndon Johnson wanted to be the second FDR. He wanted to start a new deal, the Great Society. And in fact, it's the subject of a film we're working on because we were so fascinated with Lyndon Johnson and the fact that the thing that he was most interested in was not foreign policy, but what was going on at home, war on poverty, civil rights. I mean, just only things a Southerner could promote. But he keeps on every one of Kennedy's foreign policy advisors, every single one, from McNamara and Rusk on down, George Bundy. And he says, I need you more than he did. Meaning he didn't understand this. And while I am not letting him off the hook for the horrible decisions he made and the lies that he told about the progress of the war, it is nonetheless a kind of classic Shakespearean tragedy in which his real interest is finally drowned out by the guns and the expense and the cost and the disagreement about the war in Vietnam. And so you have people squeezed in different ways, whether it's the President of the United States. They're all human beings, right?
That's right.
It's no less painful for John Musgrave than it is for Lyndon Johnson. But it's different kinds of being squeezed by this war.
You know, you talk about the deception by the American government, you know, that you do obviously the Kent State shooting is a critical moment in the film. So I've seen it 3 times in its entirety over, you know, since it was released in 2017. Most recently, I saw it in January. And I feel like the January 6th, the insurrection in this country, the questions about, you know, COVID and the mask and kind of the denialism, all of that, I think, maybe has its origins here in this period.
I think you're absolutely right, and that's incredibly astute. Let us also say that we are in a moment where we're suffering from 3 viruses. One is a little bit over a year old, and the epidemiologists have identified it, and aspects of it have been politicized in a tragic and desperately costly way. We've got a 402-year-old virus of racial injustice and disparity in the United States. And we've had an age-old human virus, which is lies, misinformation, conspiracy, paranoia. And that's always been around with every culture, and including us. And there's a very famous late historian, Richard Hofstadter, who wrote The Paranoid Style in American Politics. So I could take you back to the 1830s and the know-nothings and the fearful immigration and the rumors about this and the rumors about that and what Abe Lincoln was going to do and forced miscegenation. I mean, it's always been there. But Vietnam kind of brought that division to an apex, and it also unleashed, and many things following it. The end of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, which Reagan took away, which meant you were no longer required to be balanced in the things that you said. The fall of the Soviet Union that took away from one political party an age-old, generations-old enemy, and so they turned it on the other party. And then, of course, the creation of the Internet, which was completely unruly, undisciplined, unchecked in a way. And so anybody could say anything, and the most outrageous things get promoted. And so what you have are unintended consequences and the genie out of the bottle, the toothpaste out of the tube, and it's created something. But I think the most recent iteration can come back to divisions that Vietnam sponsored, and I think that's very, very true. I'll just add one thing to this comment, which is in 1838, a few days before his 39th birthday, a tall, thin lawyer prone to bouts of debilitating depression addressed the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois. And he said, "Whence shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall some transatlantic giant step the earth and crush us at a blow?" And he answered his own question. Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or make a track in the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we will live through all time or die by suicide. That young man was, of course, Abraham Lincoln, and he would go on to preside over the closest until now. We have come to near national suicide, and it will always be by our own hand. It will not be from a foreign enemy unless that enemy is through disinformation promoting the very divisions that beset us. we've got more in common than we have apart. And the Vietnam War teaches us that. We brought that deserter from Canada to West Point. And you can imagine what the cadets there, and we filmed it. It's one of the DVD extras that you can isolate. And at the beginning, they had their hackles up, and you would presume that this would have been a cat and dog fight. By the end, there was a realization on both parts of the shared humanity, the shared cost, and the possibility that the other might be acting with a courage you hadn't yet considered. And that's what we need today, is the kind of truth and reconciliation that comes from setting aside the easy and facile, you're the enemy, oh, you believe this, you're evil, you drink the blood of babies, all of the kind of stuff that has been able to proliferate unchecked, and remind people that we want the same things for our kids. We want a secure country. We want to protect and defend the Constitution, not a selective idea of the Constitution, but a Constitution is a flawed but, fairly good manual of operation for what maybe, we hope will be, as Lincoln himself said in the middle of the Civil War, the last best hope of Earth. We don't look like that right now. And I think the seeds of that disunion were sowed in Vietnam. The positions hardened, the disagreements sort of entrenched and generational. But the only way out is through communication and understanding and walking a mile in the other person's shoes.
That's so brilliant. And your world, the universe you've created through your documentaries really allows that. And so, maybe
we've tried in every film to do that, sir, but I don't think it's anywhere more prevalent or critical than in the Vietnam series. We know that when we deal with war, and we did one on World War II, when we deal with war, we did one on the Civil War, I'm now working on one on the American Revolution. It's a story that people have a certain sense of ideas, they've siloed their own version of what it was about. And anything that varies on that is somehow needless political correctness or cancel this or whatever, and it's not. If you tell a complicated story, nobody can be completely comfortable. And nobody should ever be completely comfortable, particularly when it comes to war. And I don't need Colonel to tell you that this is, people imagine stuff about war, and after every war, it gets encrusted with the barnacles of sentimentality. And the only time that didn't happen was in Vietnam. And that permits us the ability to get a head start on saying, let's go back and look at what happened. I think it's important, just as in the Civil War and World War II, to know this battle, to know all these battles. Because if I took away Tet, offensive from people, or, maybe one other name, nobody could name a single battle there. And yet everybody's got an opinion on it. I want to know what happened. I wanted to be able to leave that with a working knowledge of the strategy and tactics of 20 battles, and then move out to the political considerations, but move down and in to the human ones, all the human ones, from every point of view. Reporters going there gung-ho to support the stopping of communism, who many of them just suddenly went, this is not what's happening. What they're telling me in Saigon press office and what the guy out in the field is telling me isn't what the soldiers are telling me. Something's different here, or the soldier who says, I was told that we were on the 2-yard line and all we had to do is run it in for a touchdown. And I suddenly realized we're losing this war. The difference between being on the 2-yard line, first and goal, and losing the war is a really, really big difference. And we wanted to find out how that great gulf of information could happen. Have presidents lied before this time? You betcha. Are great presidents lied, like Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt? You betcha. But there was a consistent misinformation about Vietnam that went through at least 3 administrations, if not 4 or even 5, dating back to Eisenhower and to Ford, that made it impossible for the rest of us to really, truly have a grip on what was going on. And the so-called Pentagon Papers, which if you ask people were stolen classified documents. That is true. But they were assembled and called the Pentagon Papers by McNamara, who himself had doubts of the very thing that he was optimistically singing the praises of every single day, and tasks, Robert Card and Leslie Gelb to go and research it. And they uncovered, dating back to Truman, all of this stuff where everybody knew the hopelessness of this situation, that this was not a proxy war, not a limited war where we wouldn't fight World War III and our communist enemies through proxies, but this was a nationalistic fight. And if we had followed the Geneva Accords and 2 years later had an election, everybody knew that Ho Chi Minh would have been elected. And then there would be 58,000 more Americans alive. There would be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese alive, and there would be millions of other Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians still alive.
There's probably no more perfect way to land this discussion than on that. I know you're working on many things all the time. I know you're working on a series on Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali is somebody that I should know more about. I don't know a whole lot about Muhammad Ali, but, I'm not a big sports pop culture guy. But, maybe if we just close this out on what's ahead, what are you looking at? What are you doing? I know you have your hand in many, many things at the moment.
That's very kind of you, yes. We are making a film on the life of Muhammad Ali that will be out in the fall. We're doing a biography of Benjamin Franklin with Alexander Hamilton, the two most interesting people of that period who didn't get elected president. We're doing a history of the United States and the Holocaust, what we knew and when we knew it, what we did and what we didn't do and what we should have done. A very complicated, very dark thing. We're doing the American Revolution. We're doing a history of LBJ and the Great Society. We're doing a biography of the buffalo, a cautionary tale about de-extinction, I think, an animal brought to the brink of extinction and then brought back by the very people who had tried to destroy it. We're doing a history of African-American life from the Emancipation Proclamation, that is to say, January 1st, 1863, up to the beginning of the Great Migration that took African-Americans in huge numbers over many decades out of the South and into the northern states to escape the ravages of Jim Crow. And we're doing our first non-American topic on the life of Leonardo da Vinci. All of those are underway. All of them keep me up at night or wake me up early in the morning. And I'm off and running on them right now.
Okay, well, thanks so much. Look, we're not going to hold you up. Get back to it, sir, because it's such important work for the country. And, we just thank you for everything you've contributed to our understanding, to our education, and also, of course, thank you for your time.
Patriotism, someone said, is the last refuge of a scoundrel. There are scoundrels who hide behind a simplistic patriotism, but there are people who have dedicated themselves, as you have, in their lives to a kind of patriotism that very few of us can really appreciate, and others of us who, not necessarily in physical harm, but who actually work to try to show that the more complicated a picture you can show of the United States, a better one it is. And it permits us to acknowledge faults and to strengthen our strong points and to move forward with more unity than disunity. Too much pluribus right now, not enough unum. I'm in the unum business.
Sir, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Thanks to you. Bye. So that was our discussion with Ken Burns. Really, as I expected, a fascinating discussion. I was riveted by it. I hope you were. I appreciate you continuing to listen to the show, focus on the show, tell others about the show. We've rebranded for you, for our listener, and we just appreciate the continued support. Tell others about the show, the 18th Airborne Corps podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't yet, I couldn't recommend watching the Vietnam War series more strongly. Thank you so much.